Hi all, welcome back to Environmental Science. Today we're going to continue talking about ecology, but we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about specifically how population ecology works. So how do populations change over time? What's their structure? What happens from an environmental science perspective when we alter some component in the environment? How does that affect populations or community ecology, etc.? Okay, so the first kind of topic that I want to discuss is the topic of keystone species. So we'll get into kind of what defines what makes a keystone species, but we talked about it before. The term comes from like architecture or bridge building. Okay, and so old stone bridges, when you'd get to the apex or the top of the bridge, okay, when you get to the top, you had to have a special stone that was wedge shaped, okay, to connect the two kind of sides of the bridge together and form that strength. And that stone was called the keystone, or is called the keystone. And if you remove that keystone, the bridge falls apart. It's structurally not able to hold mass or weight or anything like that. And that's really where the term keystone came from, and it relates directly to population ecology. Because what we have is we have species in certain environments that if you remove that species, if you alter that species, if you change the abundance of that species, it alters the entire ecosystem, because that species is basically like that stone in a bridge. It's holding everything together. It keeps it as a complete unit. And a good example of that are sea otters. And so some of you have probably seen sea otters in the region on the coast, and they play a really important role. Although there are lots of fishermen and other individuals that find them annoying and may think that they are consuming products that they want to consume, sea otters themselves play a really important role in keeping populations of sea urchins down. Okay, and so sea urchins feed on kelp and other photosynthetic species, and so if the sea urchin populations increase, then your regions of kelp tend to decrease. And so you can have really big sea urchin population growth, and then your kelp forest will be basically destroyed or consumed. And so having a good population of sea otters means the sea urchin populations are kept at a manageable level, and the kelp forests are allowed to do photosynthesis, be around, provide for other species, not just sea urchins. And so you increase the diversity of the ecosystem by just having sea otters. Remove sea otters, sea urchins explode, the kelp forest goes away, and your diversity goes down. Okay? That means that sea otters are a keystone species. It's a classic example. Let's look at some other examples. So first, we define it as a species that plays a critical role in a biological community, regardless of its abundance. So it could be extremely abundant. We'll look at some of those, or it could be a top predator like sea otters, and it's just keeping things in check underneath it. So it doesn't have to be an apex predator. It could be a species that is a primary consumer, and it's just sitting mid-level, but it plays a really important role. It could be a primary producer. So anywhere along our energetic or biological pyramid, food pyramid, anywhere along there you can have a keystone species. And we'll look at examples of all these. Okay, so let's look at the first example. This first example is of a species that fits that kind of primary consumer role. Okay, so prairie dogs, specifically black-tailed prairie dogs, in the Midwest. So normally we're talking about maybe North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, places, Oklahoma, places like this where prairie dogs, where we consider like prairie habitat, prairie dogs play a really important role. Okay? To humans, often they're considered a nuisance species, and because burrows, these mounds, they leave holes, and cattle and horses and sheep and other things will sometimes, they'll step in a hole and they might break a leg or sprain an ankle or something like that, because of the amount of mounds. And so a lot, and farmers for that matter, and ranchers for that matter, they also don't like holes in their field, and so they often like to remove this keystone species. But this keystone species plays a really important role in the ecosystem. And so first of all, it's prey. Okay, so if you remove it, it has a negative effect on predators. So we have things like black-tailed ferrets that are an endangered species that feed on these guys. You remove it, their population goes down. There's hawks and coyotes and other predators that feed heavily on prairie dogs, and their populations will go down. Okay? If you remove it, there's obviously less mounds and burrow construction. If you do that, then habitat for species that can't dig their own burrows goes down. So things like burrowing owls, they live in the holes or in burrows, okay, but they don't have the capability of digging their own burrow. Okay? There's other things that live in burrows to escape winter and things like that, like snakes and lizards and rabbits that will use these abandoned burrows, or it doesn't always have to be abandoned. Sometimes they kick prairie dogs out of their burrow, and the prairie dog has to just move over and dig a new one. But at any rate, you remove prairie dogs, you lose that habitat. Okay? The other big part of mound building and burrowing is you're cycling the nutrients of the soil. Okay? And so you're bringing the material that's further down, that might have a lot of resources from a nutrient perspective. You're bringing it to the surface and allowing for plants to grow in that. Okay? They also play a big role in changing the plant community. Okay? So if prairie dogs are removed, grass cover increases. Okay? And from a perspective of like a rancher who might be raising cattle, this is a good thing, and this is another reason they want prairie dogs removed. But it's a bad thing from the perspective of diversity of species, okay? Because of monoculture, which meaning single type. So if you just have just grass and you don't have any forbs, you don't have any shrubs, you don't have any like trees or anything like that in the region, and it's just straight grassland, and it's not diverse, maybe it's one species, two species, then you start losing pollinators because they might be pollinating different types of plants. You start losing other organisms like birds and other things that would be feeding on the insects, the pollinators, or maybe they use a certain type of vegetation to build their nest. Okay? You lose the diversity of your megafauna, your herbivores that are feeding. So yes, you might make a monoculture and you might be able to raise cattle on it, but you lose that capability for antelope and pronghorn and deer, because your forage quality goes down when you remove these organisms from the landscape. So this is an example of that. If we're looking at a food pyramid, you have these primary producers and then primary consumers and then secondary consumers, etc. These primary consumers are driving this ecosystem. and you remove them, and it really changes a lot of things that are going on in the ecosystem. All right, let's look at another one. All right. So again, beavers, this is a classic example of a engineer. So, prairie dogs are engineering these burrows. Beavers also, in many ecosystems, are also not wanted in the ecosystem by humans and have been removed in many ecosystems because they alter the pattern of water. So instead of having streamlined, straight streams where we know exactly where the water is going, beavers will dam up that water and cause the water to be held back in regions, which can increase flooding of people's fields. It also can, decrease flow rates if an individual is using that water to, water their crops and things like that. These dams can do that. But from an ecological perspective, from an environmental perspective and diversity perspective, they're amazing. Okay, so what you're doing is you're changing this habitat from a flowing stream to one that holds water back, and in doing so, you provide habitat for breeding birds. You provide habitat for fish. You provide habitat for aquatic invertebrates, snakes, all kinds of things. You have habitat for ungulates, birds, or horses and deer and elk and other large grazers. They now have a source of water that typically stays around, so they come in and feed on that. And that increased predation rate in this region, so there are quite a few things that will eat a beaver. And so these guys, again, this is an example of one of those middle tier. Okay, they're primary consumers. They're eating vegetation, but they're controlling kind of the entire ecosystem. Not typically from a food perspective, but from an engineering perspective. So another great example of a unique engineering species that changes the ecosystem and provides a higher biodiversity. Okay. Now let's look at a top-down. All right, so this is a top-down apex predator. Okay, classic example from Yellowstone. We removed wolves in Yellowstone in the early 1900s, and the ecosystem changed greatly. I mean, when we removed wolves, population of elk, mule deer, antelope, bison, okay, all the ungulates, and grazers, they increased. Well, if you increase your primary consumers, then something has to take effect. Something has to decrease, and that's exactly what happened. The grasses decreased, the aspen decreased, all the trees really decreased because you had these big grazers that are coming through, and their populations have just exploded because there's no predator on them. And the reason why this is a classic example in Yellowstone is man couldn't fill this top predator role. Outside of Yellowstone, in regions where we might hunt these ungulates, we might hunt these grazers, okay, man can take over and kind of fill the role of a predator to a degree. Okay, not quite, but they can cull off or kill portions of the population, so you have less of an effect. But if you remove the top predator and there's no predation on, mule deer and elk and antelope and bison and things like that, which is what happened in Yellowstone, then they can have a drastic effect on your native trees and plants and things like that. And that's what they did for quite a few years. Okay, it wasn't until really the late 90s, early 2000s that we started to reintroduce wolves back into Yellowstone, and we started to see that positive effect. Okay, the wolves would keep the coyote population down. Keep the coyote population down, you increase the amount of mice you have, You increase the amount of beavers you have. Okay, it would keep the population of elk and deer and bison and antelope and all these other grazers down. Okay, not eliminating the population, because they don't just feed on a single species, but it keeps the populations down, which relieved the stress on the primary producers and allowed the primary producers to greatly increase, which in turn makes the ecosystem healthy. So now you have all these primary producers that the pressure has been relieved from their populations can increase. So then you start to see breeding birds come back in that use the trees to nest. You start to see insects that need the trees for different purposes, maybe to build nests, but also from maybe the pollen, or just to seek refuge, things like that. You start to see them come back in, which means you just increase the biodiversity in the region, because this one predator keeps things in check. Okay? And let's look at another example of a food resource that really drives a lot of food webs. Okay? And so the Antarctic food web is directly related to krill. Okay? And this is a scary one. This is an example of one of those keystone species that is so connected to an ecosystem that if predictions are right and krill are being negatively affected by raising ocean temperatures and global climate change is really affecting krill populations, it's going to have a drastic effect on the organisms within that ecosystem. See, krill is one of those primary consumers. Okay, they're consuming that phytoplankton, but their numbers are huge. The populations can get extremely large, enough that baleen whales can feed directly on krill and get enormous sizes by just eating one, these microscopic zooplankton organisms. Okay? Other things, obviously, that feed on them, fish and other organisms, birds and things like that. And then, once those fish feed on them, other things feed on those fish, and on and on and on. So if you remove this primary consumer, we have drastic effects that can occur. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is community property. So that was looking a little bit at population ecology, but really it's getting at the community. Remember, because we said that communities are all the species within a given region. Okay? And so if you remove one species, or you change the population of one organism, you can alter the population of a lot of other organisms. Okay? And that community property kind of gets at biodiversity from a point of view of like what ecosystems represent the most biodiversity. Okay? Often we have to look at this from a primary productivity range. Okay? So if we take the bottom of our food pyramid, and if that bottom of the food pyramid is limited, so if the primary producers are limited, maybe they're limited by the amount of water, maybe they're limited by the amount of light, maybe they're limited by the amount of nutrients available. If you limit primary productivity, remember we talked about the 10% rule, that only 10% of this energy gets to move to the next level. Okay? Well, if you're already starting low, then you can expect the next level is going to even be lower. And then the next lower and lower. And that's exactly what we see. So primary productivity drives biodiversity. Okay? So in regions where you have high primary productivity, like tropical rainforests, coral reefs, okay, regions where we have intense agriculture, so meaning that they probably used to be maybe grasslands, and now we planted crops that have crazy growth rates or abilities to withstand pests, or we're dumping nutrients onto these lands to get them to a higher level. These ecosystems, okay, they can support the next level to a higher degree. Okay? And so that's why we see in tropical rainforests and coral reefs, that's why we see a huge biodiversity, is because you have a diversity of primary productivity. High levels of primary productivity is going to give you high diversity of primary consumers, which gives you a higher diversity of secondary consumers, and on and on and on. So when we look at things like deserts, open ocean, there's very little primary productivity and there's very little diversity in those regions. Okay? And that really gets at the net primary productivity. Okay? The net primary productivity is really a measurement of how much energy is left after respiration. So if we look at each one of those kind of bands in the pyramid, how much energy is left after, respiration, or after you've used up the energy needed to support the organisms at that level. And that's really where that 10% rule comes in. Is like only 10% is moving up the levels. If you start with more, then the next level has more. And from this graph you can see this is just the number. So this x-axis is 1,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year. So you can see that estuaries, coral reefs, etc., rainforests, they're producing 20,000 kilocalories per meter squared per year, while you go to open ocean or the desert and they're producing 1,000 kilocalories per meter per year. So 20 times more productivity in estuaries, coral reefs, rainforests than you see in the desert or the open ocean. And from that, you would expect, just ballparking it, if you have 20 times more energy, you might have 20 times more species. Okay? Not always the case, but at least the energy is available for that species diversity. Okay? All right, so next time out, we're going to talk about abundance and diversity. We've talked about it before. We did some exercises on it, but we're going to kind of hash it out again just to make sure everybody knows this is one of the big things that environmental scientists look at, is how is species diversity in different ecosystems like the desert, the tundra, the grassland. How is it changing over time? Okay? Are human activities changing it more drastically in certain regions versus other regions? What's the species richness? What's the species evenness? We'll come back and talk about that next time.